This video is a culmination of 2 days spent on the engine dyno with our friends at Prestige Motorsports. Now, Prestige is one of the few engine builders that I know of that's still willing to spend big time in terms of money and resources and time on their R&D program because they feel it's really necessary. And this time, we're checking out multiple LS intake manifold designs and different setups on them too to see not only how much power they make, but where in the power band they do it. Because not all builds are the same. Sometimes you've got to build in a truck or wherever. You want to be able to have stump pulling torque as soon as you touch the throttle. Other times, you want that high RPM screamer that just wails down the track. And maybe we're even able to find an intake that can do both. Hang on. If we're going to be testing intake manifolds, we're going to need an engine that can push them to the max. And this big inch LS should definitely be up to the task. This is a 427 cubic inch LS sporting Prestige's own LS3 cylinder head casting. Now these heads are fully CNC ported here in-house with an aggressive 11-degree valve angle, 255cc intake ports, and 69cc combustion chambers. Combined with the 4-inch stroke and 4-inch 125 thousandth cylinder bores, the compression ratio comes up to a healthy 11.3 to 1. The camshaft is a hydraulic roller from Comp Cams. It's ground with 243 degrees of duration for the intakes at 50 thousandths tappet lift and 248 for the exhaust. Net valve lift will be right at 650 thousandths of an inch. What else? Oh, the exhaust headers have an 1 7/8" primaries and 2-inch secondaries dumping into 4-into-1 merge collectors. A Holley Dominator ECU handles all the engine controls, and for every pull, we'll be running the same 102mm Motion Raceworks throttle body and the same set of 650cc injectors from Fuel Injector Clinic. So let's get started. All the intakes we're testing are from Holley, and we'll sort of be going on the order from short to tall, or little to big, if you will. Now just ignore Justin over there, who's trying to get things done and work for a living, while I'm getting in his way and setting up cameras and everything. But first up, we've got the Holley Ultra Low Ram. Now granted, it's not as sexy as the high ram as some of the other intake manifolds, but if you're trying to maintain a stock hood, this may be the only way to go. So let's see how it does. The Ultra Low Ram name is no lie. This casting stands just 6.86 inches tall thanks to that flat plenum top and low throttle body mount. Heck, this thing actually sits lower than the fuel rails. It's obvious this manifold has been designed for applications where you have a low hood line and want to keep a stock or maybe even sleeper look. Those short runners will probably lend themselves well to developing power high in the RPM range, but we wondered if the small plenum area, thanks to that flat top and the low throttle body location, will choke off any power those short runners can make. Time to find out. All I've got to say here is, wow. The Ultra Low Ram did way better than I expected. On the dyno, we made pulls on every intake from 4,000 to 6,900 RPM. And as you probably expected, the Ultra Low Ram did a good job of making power in the upper RPM range. Torque peaked at 543.8 foot-pounds at 5,700 RPM and 639.6 horsepower at 6,700. Spoiler alert here, I'm going to jump ahead and let you know that this intake produced the most horsepower in terms of both peak and average throughout the range for any test we did until we got to the decidedly race-oriented high ram. But we're not there yet. Next up is what Holley calls their mid-rise intake. You may not have seen this one before because it's definitely the oddball of the group. Most LS intakes have a few common traits, namely, they utilize a large open plenum with 8 equal length runners feeding directly from it. Not the mid-rise. With this thing, think old school carbureted dual plane intake manifold. Holley says this is a modular unit using a few different components. They started with Holley's 2x4 intake manifold, which is designed to accept 2 4-barrel carbs or throttle bodies. Here, you can see the unequal length runners and the plenum connector between the 2 main sections of the intake. Also, I don't know if you can tell from this angle, but the plenum floor is actually stepped like a dual plane. Here, this shot's better. It just helps to produce some really long runner lengths to help make great low end torque. But this is definitely an EFI intake, and we're going to be bolting up the same 102mm throttle body in a front breather configuration just like all the others. This is just the lower section. Oh, and check out how it's slanted forward. The idea here is that the intake sits nice and level when you're under hard acceleration. That's more of an issue for carbureted applications and not as much for EFI like we're using. The middle section goes on next, which does provide the mid-rise with a large common plenum. As you can see, it does have machined and tapered inlets to the ports. And remember, this part of the intake is dry. When the engine is running, there will only be air moving through here, no fuel. Anyhow, it bolts down and a pair of gaskets seal it to the lower casting. And then the upper plenum piece can be installed. As far as I can tell, this is the same as is used on the low and the high rammed intakes. And then the throttle body and everything else gets bolted up just like before. Well, mostly like before. Remember, I told you we were using the same fuel injectors in the same holes for every test. The problem with that is the fuel rails aren't all the same height. On the mid-rise, the fuel rails were at a taller height. So, to be able to use the same injectors, Prestige installed these blue anodized extensions. Problem solved. Anyhow, time to make a pull. Oh, and if you notice the wires hanging down from that Y-shaped frame above the engine, Prestige is now monitoring individual cylinder O2 levels. It won't play a big role in our intake manifold test here, but it is pretty trick tech, and hopefully we'll get to take advantage of it in future videos. Dyno results for the mid-rise intake were interesting. I often get comments about starting a dyno pull from right off idle. And honestly, the way the mid-rise seems to make power way down low, that would have been useful. But you just can't do that because an engine dyno can be incredibly hard on an engine at low RPMs. That's because during a pull, the dyno holds the engine speed down as it ramps up the RPMs at a set rate. The engine isn't allowed to rev up quickly like it would in a vehicle. When you hold an engine at a low RPM with the throttle wide open, the combustion pressures can damage the pistons, connecting rods, bearings, and even crack a crankshaft. That's why we didn't start the dyno pull until 4,000 RPM. But it's obvious this intake would be a beast down low, making big torque as soon as you pick up the throttle. So even though this intake manifold doesn't make the most peak power, don't disregard it out of hand. When we began the pull, the mid-rise is making 500 foot-pounds of torque. That's 23 better than the ultra-low ram, and it will be 10 better than anything else we test. And then it doesn't drop below that 500 foot-pound mark until 6,400 RPM. A broad torque band like that is always going to be fun, but those long runners make it tough for the mid-rise to make the horsepower on up top. In fact, peak was just 602.3 horsepower. Now that's definitely respectable, but it's between 20 and 40 horsepower off the peaks the other intakes made. But the guys at Prestige made a great point when it comes to the mid-rise. We don't race dynos, and when it comes to the real world, it's big torque and the ability to spin the tires as soon as you pick up the throttle that makes a car or truck so much fun to drive. They said if you did a blind test and put an average Joe in identical cars with the different intakes we're testing, the big torque generated by the mid-rise at the lower RPM range would make it the favorite 8 out of 10 times. So don't be fooled just by looking at the peak numbers here. Third on the testing lineup is Holley's low ram intake. The low ram has runners that look extremely short, but you can see without the plenum top on that the runners actually extend into the bottom of the plenum a bit to help increase the length a smidge. While the ultra low ram has a total height of 6.86 inches, the low ram comes in a bit taller at 9 1/4. That's mostly thanks to the upper plenum, which has a curved top and raises the throttle body position. Still, this intake should be able to fit underneath the hood of a wide range of vehicles. Holley also says the low ram is a great option for installing an intercooler between the upper and lower sections of the intake to cool the incoming air charge without raising the top of the intake too high. On the dyno, the low ram performed well all around. Peak numbers were 542 foot-pounds of torque at 5,700 RPM and 627.9 horsepower at 6,700. Averages across the range were 512.8 on the torque and 532.6 horsepower. Now, we're going to take a quick detour. Instead of bolting up a fresh new intake, the guys at Prestige wanted to make another quick test with the low ram. Some aftermarket manufacturers are selling spacers that go in between the upper and lower portions of the manifold. I guess it's kind of based on the old days when you could pop on a carb spacer to add a little plenum volume and sometimes eke out a few more horsepower. So the idea here is to test a 1-inch spacer from some other company. I'm not really sure who made it on the low ram to see how it affects power. My dyno chart is already getting pretty crowded. So for this test, I'm just comparing the stock low ram to the low ram with a 1-inch plenum spacer. And as you can see, it didn't really make much of a difference. On the peaks, we saw an increase of 2.3 foot-pounds of torque, but lost 4.3 horsepower. By and large, the conclusion I took from this test is the engineers at Holley have done a pretty good job optimizing the design of their intakes. The money spent on this piece of aluminum, at least in a naturally aspirated engine configuration, can be put to better use somewhere else. So, off came the low ram with the spacer, and Senior and I set about getting to the big boy in our test, Holley's high ram intake manifold. This is the one that gets all the attention. The high ram is the design that's all about developing power with little regard to fitting under a stock hood. Heck, this thing is tall. It stands at 12.32 inches. But the design obviously works because you see this intake all the time in big power street strip cars. Before we get the plenum top bolted up, you can see the difference in the lower plenum versus the low ram intake. The runners here don't extend beyond the plenum floor like before, but blend smoothly. Also, you can see just how tall the inlet runners are, along with being nice and straight with no curves. Just how a race engine likes it. And man, does the high ram produce power by the truckload. I'm not including the previous test with the 1-inch plenum spacer here just to make the dyno graph a little bit easier to see. Even with the longer runners, the high ram loves to operate in the upper RPM range. It turns out this intake provides the best of both worlds. Peak torque jumped up 8.6 from our previous best with the mid-rise, and horsepower increased 1.9 from the ultra-low ram, giving us the best numbers for both. And the averages across the range were even better, with improvements over our previous bests of 13.6 and 14.5 respectively, to get 530.5 foot-pounds of torque and 550.1 horsepower. Those kinds of improvements across the range are pretty hard to come by. No wonder the high ram is such a popular option when it comes to big power engine packages. And now, one more test as a bonus for you. Prestige CNC ports its own cylinder head castings and happened to have on hand a high ram that they had custom CNC ported for a bucks down big power engine they're building. Since it was available, we decided to try it too. The plenum top was the same, only the runners had been ported. And as you can see, the difference between the ported runner intake and the stock version is actually quite minimal. Here's a graph of the stock high ram versus the ported version. These ported intake runners did probably what you would expect. In the lower RPM range, the larger runners caused the engine to lag behind the stock high ram a bit until the upper RPM range when the engine needed even more airflow. By 6,300 RPM, the CNC high ram took over and never looked back. But let's be honest, how often do you need power beyond 6,300 RPM unless you're building a pure race engine? The CNC ported high ram definitely has its place, but it's on the big power, high RPM screamers that will see most of their time at the drag strip. So, what did we learn after our 2 glorious days on the dyno? Well, there are no losers here. Every intake manifold we tested has its place. You got a low hooded sports car, or maybe you want to maintain sleeper status while still making the most horsepower possible? Well, then the ultra low ram might be for you. You want to make ridiculous amounts of torque right from the hit? Hey, look at the low rise. Or don't want to give up any torque or horsepower? Hey, I hear you. But don't mind cutting a hole in your hood? Well, then the high ram is obviously for you. The good news here is that they all work for a purpose. Hey, thanks again for watching The Horsepower Monster, and we'll see you next time.